Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Nos programmes offrent plusieurs langues. Veuillez visiter suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Nuestros programas ofrecen varios idiomas. Visiten suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Acara kami menyediakan banyak bahasa. Silakan lihat suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Well, it's a swarm of enormous proportions. Desert locusts are eating their way across large parts of East Africa, and it's the worst outbreak some countries there have seen in 70 years.
Warning signs to help end climate change. Locust swarms part 1 of 3. Continue watching to find out more.
OCO means hello in Cherokee, one of the Iroquoian languages. I'm Tehoka. The Iroquois people thank you for your kind consideration to reduce the footprints on the environment by choosing an animal-free diet. Noble viewers, welcome to part 1 of our 3-part series, Warning Signs to Help End Climate Change, Locust Swarms. On today's program, we'll travel to Africa to learn about the recent massive invasion of locusts that the continent has experienced. The plague began in June 2019 and has continued through 2020. Billions of desert locusts, resembling dark storm clouds, have descended on the Horn of Africa, destroying vast areas of cropland and vegetation. Known as the world's oldest and most dangerous migratory pests, locusts have been around since at least 3,200 BC, severely affecting agricultural life in vulnerable countries. The locust is a type of grasshopper that is fairly harmless when alone, but when weather conditions are right, the insects unite, change their color and behavior, and form massive swarms. Desert locusts are much larger than common grasshoppers and can be the size of an adult human's hand. Once airborne, the locusts can travel many kilometers each day, borne by the wind, devouring almost all the vegetation in their path. Taken together, the scale, speed, and destructive capacity of locust swarms make them a serious threat to international agriculture. Dr. Rick Overson of Arizona State University's Global Locust Initiative further explains, they are powerful, long-distance flyers, so they can easily go 100+ kilometers in a 24-hour period. They can easily move across countries in a matter of days, which is one of the other major challenges in coordinated efforts that are required between nations and institutions to manage them. As the locusts have devastated the vegetation in huge areas of East Africa, the world has watched in horror.
Well, it's a swarm of enormous proportions. Desert locusts are eating their way across large parts of East Africa, and it's the worst outbreak some countries there have seen in 70 years. Now, here are some of the countries that are most affected by those locusts. Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are the worst affected, and Uganda is bracing for an invasion too. Authorities have advised citizens to stock up on food as the insects approach the border with Kenya. Now, researchers say they pose an unprecedented threat to food security in some of the world's most vulnerable countries.
The swarms of desert locusts hang like shimmering dark clouds on the horizon as they rob the countryside in what already some of the world's most vulnerable countries.
The locust plague came as many countries in East Africa were already struggling to manage food insecurity caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, about 20 million people are experiencing acute food scarcity in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Tanzania. The severity of the region's food shortage was echoed by Cyril Ferrand, the FAO's resilience team leader for Eastern Africa. The generation we are combating now is the most damaging in terms of food security impact. Experts have related the cause of the locust invasion with extreme weather conditions produced by climate change. Desert locusts prefer to lay their eggs in damp, sandy soil near vegetation and flourish when normally arid areas are drenched by rain. In 2019, the fluctuations in seawater temperature, known as the Indian Ocean Dipole, was at near record strength with temperature changes not seen in decades. This situation led to torrential rainfall in East Africa, Yemen, and India. Moreover, a series of cyclones that scientists have linked to unusually warm seas rolled in from the Indian Ocean, soaking a sandy desert in the Arabian Peninsula known as the Empty Quarter. With the rains, the desert began to grow lush with vegetation, thus creating the perfect conditions for locusts to breed and spread from Yemen to East Africa. Entomologist and evolutionary biologist Dr. Dino Martins, the executive director of the Impala Research Center in Kenya, explains, "We often think of deserts as environments that are very harsh and low productivity, which they are a lot of the time. But when deserts have the right conditions, they can flip, and you can move to a situation with lots of biological activity. That's basically what we're seeing now." We'll take a moment now to pray for the protection of the vulnerable communities being affected by locust infestations. Please stay tuned to Supreme Master Television. Welcome back to our program. Several African countries, including Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Uganda, have battled the swarms for many weeks. The United Nations states that the current outbreak is the worst of its kind in decades and warns that the locust plague is an alarming and unprecedented threat to food security. To make matters worse, many of the affected countries are already suffering from the coronavirus outbreak and from severe weather conditions, including droughts and floods.
The insects prevalent in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia have devastated supplies in communities already battling food security due to drought. The swarms were worsening the impacts of climate change already being felt in the region, according to officials. In Ethiopia, where floods have already affected the harvest, the insects have destroyed hundreds of squares of kilometers of vegetation in the Amhara and Tigray regions.
In April 2020, large swarms of locusts began descending on northern Kenya, raising concerns among its citizens. According to the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research Analysis, 2.6 million Kenyans are said to be experiencing food insecurity, and the COVID-19 pandemic has further threatened the nation's food supplies. Now, with the locust plague, the livelihoods of thousands of farmers are also threatened. As billions of locusts have invaded farmers' crops, the swarms have multiplied by as much as 400 times, spreading far beyond Kenya's borders. An article in the scientific journal Nature reported that in Kenya, one unusually large swarm occupied an area of 2,400 square kilometers, more than 3 times the size of New York City. Swarms typically occupy 100 square kilometers. Even at this size, they can contain from 4 to 8 billion locusts, which can consume the amount of food 3.5 million people would eat in a day. After affecting Kenya, the locusts headed toward Uganda, where a large number of people are facing hunger. On April 3, 2020, the insects came through the town of Amudat in northern Uganda, and authorities became deeply concerned about the devastation the insects could cause.
The FAO says the infestation was the worst of its kind in 25 years for Ethiopia and Somalia, and the worst Kenya has experienced in 70 years. Meanwhile, authorities in Uganda have advised citizens to stock on food as the alarming locust invasion raging through East Africa approaches the border with Kenya.
When they enter a farmer's field, the locusts can consume virtually everything green within a matter of hours. Thus, they are dangerous, not only to food security, but to the very livelihoods of farmers. Ms. Agnes Kirabo, Executive Director of Food Rights Alliance, or FRA, explains, "This new exodus of swarms is more destructive and a big threat to food security. To farmers, it's not a loss of food, but a loss of life. This is very tragic and a big threat to an already less resilient agriculture sector and food system. According to FRA, 10.1 million people in Uganda are suffering from hunger and food insecurity. Meanwhile, the locust plague has continued. In February 2020, an enormous swarm of desert locusts descended on northeastern Uganda, covering an area of about 40,500 hectares, or 100,000 acres.
They eat and destroy everything on their way. One swarm measured 60 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. Hundreds of thousands of acres of crops destroyed. People fight back with whatever means they have. The swarms came from Yemen, then down from the Red Sea to the Horn of Africa. The unusual warm temperatures off the coast are partly to blame. The recent heavy rainfall has created the perfect breeding conditions.
The African nations that have already suffered from the first wave of locusts are now concerned about a second wave. Dr. Antonio Querido, country representative of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, for Uganda, says heavy rains in late March established favorable breeding conditions for yet another generation of locusts in the Horn of Africa. These will emerge as young swarms in June, just as many farmers start to harvest. The amount of unpredictable weather to come will be crucial in determining how long the crisis lasts and which areas will be affected next. Climate change experts have warned that warming oceans that feed cyclones could continue to create conditions for record-breaking swarms of desert locusts. Such plagues could grow larger and more widespread if climate change continues. Concerned viewers, thank you for your company today. During Warning Signs to Help End Climate Change, Locust Swarms Part 1 of 3. Please join us again next Monday, October 12th, for Part 2 of 3 in this series. Coming up next is Oscar and Laura Center, a haven for Bulgarian street dogs, right after noteworthy news. We wish you and your loved ones safety, well-being, and continuing spiritual progress.
Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule and suprememastertv.com/PE.